Hear me on this, because hear me, young brother, if you've already decided she is the one, you couldn't hear God if he said she's not the one. In other words, sis, if you've already decided that he's just a friend, then you can't hear God if he says that he might be more than a friend. In other words, if you've already decided not to get the surgery, you can't hear if God says that's your path to healing. In other words, if you've already decided on Spelman or Howard, you can't hear if God says Oakwood is where I want you to be. And see, I need somebody to know that the greatest barrier to divine revelation is a made-up mind. You see, too often we invert the order. We make up our minds before God has spoken. But the truth is, you make up your mind once God has spoken. We make up our mind based upon our preference, but you settle your mind based upon his promise. There are times where we make up our minds based on what's convenient, but you make up your mind on your spiritual convictions. And see, church, there are times where our world is imploding, where, man, our decisions come to a marvelous ruin, where we are being buffeted by the choices of our own making. And what happens is when our world begins to collapse, we get to a place where we cry out to the Lord and we wonder why God is not speaking. We're stressed because God is not talking. But what I've learned the hard way is that the only time God stops speaking is when we stop listening. In other words, church, I need somebody to know that the greatest key for being able to hear the word of God, it is not necessarily your moral perfection. It is not necessarily your ardent prayerfulness. I need you to know that the primary trait of being able to hear God is to maintain an openness to whatever God has to say. Are y'all hearing the pastor today? All right, real quick, let me say it this way. In other words, here, I have three types of vessels here on this table. Zoom in real quick. And see, I am at a place where I want to pour something into a vessel. But I need you to recognize I can't pour nothing into this vessel because it's a closed vessel. Oh, y'all acting brand new. In other words, I got a lot to give, but I can't give it to a vessel that's already closed. But then I want to give it to this vessel, but this vessel is so full that it ain't got no room to receive. Y'all missing it today. In other words, I can't give nothing to a closed vessel. And see, the problem is, it's not that you can't hear God say forgive. You're just closed to forgiveness. You're closed to moving. You're closed to adjusting. And the reason some can't hear God do certain things is because you're so full of your own opinion. You're so full of your own ideas. You're so full of what somebody else has to say. And so I need you to know that there is a third vessel. It's not better than the other vessels. The only advantage is that it's open and it's empty. And it's available to receive what I have to pour. And can I suggest that God is looking for some available vessels? He's looking for some open vessels. He's looking for some empty vessels to receive.